Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. It is Friday, May 10th, 2024. Welcome to episode 0 of Wake, an experiment that has no true meaning, purpose, or structure, but which fulfills a long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegans Wake out loud just once. My name is Toby Malone, and I'm joined in this first episode, and hopefully in many more in the future, with my writing partner, my dear, dear friend, and all-round amazing guy, TJ Young. Hi, TJ.
Oh, hi, Toby. I'm so excited to be here. This is fantastic.
I can't believe you agreed to do it. It's one
of those ask and I follow. So
I know, and it's worked out pretty well so far. But asking you to read James Joyce, and not just James Joyce, but the hardest James Joyce, the one that no one's read, this is a lot. So who knows how long this will take? I mean, the book is many, many hundreds of pages long and mostly impenetrable.
Yeah, it's hard to get through.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough. What are we doing here? I mean, when I first pitched the idea of reading Finnegans Wake, what did you think? What was your first impression that came up when I said to you, I've got this long-held ambition and I really want to read this book that no one's read, and I want to do it on a podcast to make myself accountable? What did you think?
You know, it for you, I was like, this makes sense. This fits. This feels like something Toby would want to do. But also, I thought this is the one thing that when I was an English major in college, right? And we talked about James Joyce, and they always talked about Finnegans Wake. It's this like thing that, the teacher was like, don't worry about that. Just don't worry about that one.
Right.
So I was intrigued because it's kind of been one of those things that even people who like read the classics all the time, the people who like Moby Dick's one of the best books ever, if you say Finnegans Wake, they're like, nah, I'm good. So, I'm interested to see what it's all about. And,
good.
And more so why people run away from it.
Yeah, I mean, Moby Dick. Moby Dick is one of my favorites because it's long and it's dense, but it's a story, man. Like it's an adventure, and that final chapter or the final couple chapters where
it's so good,
where the whale is like finally just like crushing that boat. Oh man, like that. Yeah, that's all time. So yeah, I mean, I know that there are a lot of books that people resist because they're long and they're hard, and there are some like David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, which is long and hard on purpose and trying just to mess with us. Finnegans Wake is one of those ones that it's kind of up there on the top of the mountain, the way you go, oh, just never mind, no one's going to read it, forget it. And so I've generally had a fairly good relationship with Joyce. I come from Irish stock, but many years ago now. But the Irish element was always a big part of my family lore, and so my father was always talking about Ulysses and a lot of the books in the canon. And so I've read a bunch of them, and I generally. I like to read before bed every night. I usually read for half an hour, 45 minutes before bed every night, and that's how I get my leisure reading done. But I tried Finnegans Wake once. I put it beside the bed, and I think I lasted 3 days of just going, I don't know what this is, because I was reading silently. I was trying not to be disturbing, and I was trying to understand it as a narrative. Mm-hmm. And that's the first mistake that I made, and I feel as though it's the kind of thing that trips a lot of people up. And so, yeah, I mean, do you have a relationship with Joyce? Have you read much of him?
Yeah, I've read Ulysses and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and it's a complicated relationship because I realized in undergrad I was just a little punk, and when they say read this thing, you do it begrudgingly, because you'd rather be off partying or doing literally.
Yeah.
So like I read it for the class, as much quotes that you want to put around that, and then I was just like on to the next. So I'm excited to kind of recontextualize myself with the work. I know this is the hardest work to kind of contextualize yourself with in general, but I'm finding as I get more mature in both my artistry and as a reader, I go back to those books and those authors that I read in school and didn't want to read, and I'm like, oh, there's a reason why they had us read this,
Yeah.
because it's actually really good. And I'm sorry I was an asshole. Like, you know,
Yeah. I always feel as though some of those classics, particularly something like Ulysses, which you can kind of follow, there is a narrative structure that follows Bloom around Dublin, but I've always equated it to kind of like going to an art gallery where you're not really interested in the art. But so you walk into the room and you walk past all the paintings and you walk out again 3 minutes later and you say, I've done that room. I've done that.
Mhm.
All I got to do is just walk past the things and I've seen all the things. And of course, you haven't seen anything. You've just been in the presence of them, but you haven't actually taken it in. And so getting a chance to sit back and really appreciate it. I feel as though I read Ulysses in the similar kind of vein of just being like, I've seen all of the words, so I must have read the book. But
Exactly.
but there were certain points that stuck out. I mean, my relationship. I've read. So going from easiest to hardest in Joyce, I read Dubliners, which is very accessible and
Mhm.
is really useful, and obviously it's been adapted into stage plays and things. So Dubliners and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which again is fairly accessible and fairly comprehensible. And then Ulysses, and I think I read that maybe in my late 20s or early 30s, maybe early 30s, and don't really think I got very much of it.
Right.
I appreciated it, um, but Finnegans Wake is where I stopped. And obviously he's written other things, but those are the four sort of monuments to
Mhm.
Joyce. And there's no real shame to having not read Finnegans Wake, but I sort of thought I want to have read this, and I thought reading it silently isn't the thing. It's not going to be the way that I'm going to read this because you're processing stuff that isn't necessarily narrative, isn't necessarily meant to be understood on that sense. So I need to hear it out loud. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to make it a summer project where every day I'm going to go into my bedroom, I'm going to read 20 pages of Finnegans Wake out loud to myself. And that's going to be my project. And of course, how do you stay motivated for something like that?
Mhm.
So that never happened. And then I thought, well, maybe maybe I should record it to keep myself accountable. And I thought, who do I know who is a beloved podcaster and who would do anything that I ask him to do? And that's TJ. So I mean, you're also the busiest man I know. So I know that there will be some weeks when you won't be available because you're teaching and doing all the things that you do, and also being a award-winning internationally produced playwright.
Hmm.
But hey, that's you. Um, um, so there'll be some weeks where I'll be doing this by myself, and there'll be some weeks where I'll be doing it with guests. My 12-year-old daughter has already agreed that she's going to do a section, so I'm excited about that one.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, and so the idea is not necessarily for me to say every word. Obviously, it's I want to read it. I want to be able to do some of it myself. I want to ask friends to come in and read some stuff. I want you to read some stuff. I just, it's just to hear it and to go, what is this? Because there's a whole bunch, it's been described in so many different ways. I mean, Seamus Dean, in his introduction to the edition that we're working with, calls it an extraordinary performance. Terence McKenna has said that if Ulysses is the algebra of literature, then Finnegans Wake is the partial differential equation, which I think is amazing.
Which just terrifies me because A, I hate math. And B, I'm like, if you're
Yeah.
describing anything like that, I'm like, oh, is my brain ready to melt, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Wim van Milo famously said that it was an uncreated punning machine, and I think that's a really interesting part of this book because Joyce is so sure of his own genius. I mean, and he took a long time to write this thing, and so interested in language and how he can use puns and things like that. It's so far up its own butt that it's almost incomprehensible because you'll have a single line and it'll have 7 different puns in it in 3 different languages, and so we're not supposed to really understand it because I mean we were talking about this before, and you pointed out this quote from Stanislaus Joyce, who is Joyce's own brother, who read sections of Finnegans Wake, who said, TJ, do you want to read in the voice of Stanislaus Joyce?
The work of a psychopath or a huge literary fraud.
If this is the
The family member
family What do his enemies think? And he had enemies. There was Nabokov, who wrote Lolita, so a good guy all round. Was one of his enemies. You want to give us Nabokov's version of what he thinks?
The unfortunate Finnegans wake is nothing but a formless and dull mass of phony folklore, a cold putting of a book, a persistent snore in the next room, most aggravating to the insomniac I am.
I mean, wow. Yeah, I mean, formless and dull mass of phony folklore. Yeah, it's a really obviously that people have opinions.
Ringing endorsement from
Absolutely, H.G.
Nabokov there.
Wells. H.G. Wells, the man who wrote The Time Machine, and
I just like the way this quote starts.
who the hell is this Joyce who demands so many waking hours of the few thousand I have still to live for a proper appreciation of his quirks and fancies and flashes of rendering?
I want someone to just walk into anything I've written and be like, who the hell is this guy?
I have so little time left on this earth, and you want me to spend time with
How
this?
dare you? How dare you?
So it's going to be a nice, relaxing read then. Like very clearly, it makes people angry. I don't expect anyone to ever listen to this podcast. Part of me hopes no one ever does. And this is very much a selfish kind of thing, but I don't think this is going to be a nice, relaxing listen either. Because I mean, in certain ways, I think if you're looking for insight into the book or a analysis of what's happening scene to scene, you might have to look elsewhere. I think what this
You are
is,
going to don't say might. Let's let them know.
What this is a chance to hear it out loud, to hear the poetry work, because it's just to hear it like it's like a soundscape, like the words are being said. I'm not going to edit the podcast at all, so I'm not going to go back in and take out the bits where I mispronounce things or where I stumble or where I don't think I'm going to make commentary as I go. I'm going to try to read it as I go, but there will be mistakes and there will be mispronunciations. There is a lot of other languages in this book. I don't speak many other languages. I speak English and I can read a bit of French, but I don't have any other languages. So yeah, I mean, so and before we did this, I did an experiment, and so I put it. I read the first 20 pages to myself. I recorded it, and then I sent the recording to TJ. Just because I can really attest to the power of hearing these words out loud, because these words are really something else. I mean, what was so you listened? I mean, when I sent it to you, I said, listen to the first minute and then, let me know what you think. And you, God bless you, listened to all 20 minutes. I don't know how you did it, but you got something from it, I think.
I did. Yeah, there is something about the rhythm and the cadence of it, and even the way that's laid out on the page, because as you were reading it, I was following along on the page, because I think that was just helpful for me to see the translation from the written text to like the potential sounds, right? And some of the sections are just like potential sounds, let's be very clear.
Right.
But there were like these moments of Joyce's poetry that kind of stuck out in the midst of all the sometimes chaos. And it kind of becomes like a literary ASMR in a way, where your brain starts to focus on it, and then it realizes it can't really focus on it, so it's just going to let it wash over it. And then like you pick up what you can, but then you try to focus on it again. And it was interesting because lately I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks, but audiobooks, if I feel like I missed a section, or that was crucial to the understanding of it, of course I'll rewind it and try to listen to it 3 more times to actually get it. But this, I was like, I could just let this go.
Mm-hmm.
Which is both strange but also kind of like a release.
Yep.
To be like, like if I didn't get that thing, I probably wasn't meant to get it, so it's totally fine. It's not like it's not like a contemporary novel where every sentence is edited and structured within an inch of its life to supply meaning to the next 4 sentences, which it probably is.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it is just like, this is just words happening. But then like, he describes water and the sounds that are happening. I was like, this feels like the personification or the onomatopoeia of the water. And he's like, of course, this is how he would write it. And so some of those things were super interesting. He still has really beautiful turns of phrases in it that really stuck out to me.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, if people, when people listen, if they want to follow along in the book, I think that was helpful for me
Right.
anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really interesting what you say about that sort of verbal ASMR idea of it, because the closest thing I can think of to this that I've witnessed in a live theatre was when I saw a production of Samuel Beckett's Not I, which, if you're not familiar with Not I, just put it into YouTube and just watch. There is a very famous recording by Billy Whitelaw in, I want to say in the 70s, but I'm just guessing there. But it was, so Billy Whitelaw was an actress who did this production of Beckett's Not I, and Beckett was, Beckett was Beckett, and he, not everything is Godot. So he was a real experimenter. He tried to do different kinds of things, and Not I was one of these things where he had an actress suspended 20 feet above the stage, in a completely blacked out theater with a tiny spotlight just on her mouth, and all you saw was a floating mouth in the air. And the play is close to an hour, or maybe 45 minutes, and it's stream of consciousness and babbling. It's very, very fast. It's incredibly difficult. It's again impenetrable, and it's one of those things where when you start watching it, it's almost like an endurance test. When I used to be a teacher, I used to show this to my first year theatre students on the first day to say, "This is theatre," and they would all go, "What is that? I don't understand." And I would show them 3 minutes. I wouldn't show them an hour. But it's one of those things, watching that, because I thought, oh well, this is a rare opportunity to see something like this live. I have to go to see it, and so we went along to see this production. I knew what I was getting myself into: the suspended mouth in the air, and the fact that the script itself, which you can read the script. If you read the script from top to bottom, it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense either. And then a lot of people say that the chatter of the mouth is supposed to replicate the chatter in our brains, that internal dialogue. But after 5 minutes of it, where your brain is desperately looking for meaning, it's searching for sense, it's searching for something that means something, and you're trying to piece things together or trying to make connections. And after a while, there's no point, because there's nothing to find. There's no connection there, and you start to drift away. And I found that when I started reading. When I did the reading the other day and did 20 pages, it became like this endurance test where at the beginning it's just sort of trying to get going. But after a little while, it's like going on a 10-mile run, and the first mile is hard, and then you relax into it and you feel okay, and then suddenly you notice that 15 minutes have gone by, and you haven't actually noticed the pain or noticed. And I feel as though a lot of it is that it's just sort of rolling through. And I think there'll be sometimes, particularly if we have guests in who are not really on board with the whole
They'll be like,
thing.
what is happening?
Yeah, we might. Yeah, it might just fall down. I don't know. We might last 3 episodes, and I might, just it might. But I think this will keep us grounded. So it's an interesting book. I mean, it's known for its experimental style, as we've been talking about, as one of the most challenging works in the Western canon. It's sort of considered a famous essential text. Harold Bloom, who is a professor in New York, who's written on all sorts of things, wrote his book in the late 90s about the Western canon, and he includes Finnegans Wake as one of the essential books of the Western canon, but he makes it very clear that no one's read it. I'm sure Bloom has read it, because he's that kind of guy, and he has some analysis of it, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but it's essentially unread by the wider public, because it's hard. It's got this nonlinear structure. It's kind of this dream state, the content there, and really blurs the reality boundaries between reality and imagination with this really interesting cyclical structure. And I think that's kind of the most famous thing about Finnegans Wake, is that the first sentence starts in the middle of a sentence, and the last sentence of the book is the beginning of that sentence. And so it's the idea that this is a cycle. And there are a lot of different things. I will talk about some of the themes and things in a minute, but just the very fact that in order to start the book, you need to finish the book is kind of bananas. It feels a lot like he's
Tarantino before Tarantino.
Yeah, Tarantino wishes.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of what we've done some research. I try to cite the sources where I can, but I'm not promising analysis or insight. I'm not a professor of Joyce. I'm not. I do have a background in English literature, but I'm a Shakespearean primarily. So my interest is not necessarily to give the canonical analysis of Finnegans Wake. And if you're here listening for that, I'm going to disappoint you over and over again, because sometimes our analysis will be like, what was that? I don't know. And that's fine. That's fine. Look, if it gives me an opportunity to sit and talk to TJ every week, then I'm all for it. But if you do want insight into the words, I strongly recommend a website called finwake.com, finwake.com, which has a really good analysis line by line. It's punching in its detail.
It's one of those people that are like, this is my life's work. This
Yeah,
is the thing I will leave behind
yeah,
when the world is done.
exactly. So I mean, so if we're not going to now analyze it, and we're not going to prepare, I mean, our preparation is going to be minimal on each of these. Literally going to be picking up a physical copy of the book. We both have exactly the same edition right in our hands here. And we're just going to read it. I mean, from the edition that we're working with, which is, is the Penguin Modern Classics edition of Finnegans Wake, if you're interested in following along. Generally, these are fairly standard between editions in terms of the page counts and the edition that we're working with. So you should be able to get any copy of Finnegans Wake and follow it along. I mean, there was no revision. Joyce was so devastated with the reception. I think that was that when it came
You
to
know what's
working
crazy
on
to me
this thing.
though? No one's read this book, but the book is in demand enough that they continue to reprint
Oh
it.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's a doorstop too. It's a big old thing. It's
It's a thick one.
600 and some pages, 630, 628 pages long. So yeah, it's a big old one. And so this edition, the Penguin Modern Classics edition, is edited has an introduction written by a scholar named Seamus Dean, a very useful introduction to give you sort of some context. And there's a lot of really interesting information there, very much like what we're talking about with Finnegans Wake. I started to glaze over a little bit in a lot of the introduction and be like, all right, Seamus, I got it. But Dean does say the first thing to say about Finnegans Wake is that it is, in an important sense, unreadable. The reader must forego most of the conventions about reading and about language that constitute him or her as a reader. And I think that's really important,
Mhm.
because we kind of expect that we're going to be the master of a book when we come in and we go, okay, well, I will. I mean, the best thing about reading, private reading, as opposed to seeing theater or television, is that in a book, if you miss something, you can go back. You can
Mhm.
flip back 6 pages and go, oh, okay, I understand that relationship. But in this, there's nothing to flip back to, or there are thematic things you can pick up on. There's interesting things you can. I mean, there is there are characters, there is plot, and we'll talk about that. But but as he says, the practice of reading for the story has to be abandoned.
Which is so hard. I mean, we're taught to learn through story. We're
Yeah,
taught, everything we see. Even when you talk about your day, you start to form it in the story of your day.
right.
And so to pick up something that's been printed, and books have always been like, this is a story. To have to abandon that, it's just
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
be a hard thing to do.
Absolutely. And, it becomes this stream of consciousness thing. It almost becomes poetry. It's like a tone poem in many ways, where you're hearing these words, and after a while the words become gibberish, and then maybe there's a word that's familiar that pops out, and then maybe there's a turn of phrase, and then there's lots of structural things. There are some sections that have multiple voices speaking simultaneously. We've got to figure out how we're going to do that. We have some sections that have footnotes. We have some sections that are written like a dramatic play. So it's really interesting. There's sections that have like bars of music, and okay, so I've already, we've got a singer standing by to give us that. Yeah, there's lots of really interesting things. I mean, but in one of the the resources that we've been using, the suspended sentence, which is a very useful resource. One of the questions is how does one read a torrent of nonsense? The first tip is to give up on the idea of seeking total comprehension, or even the idea that there is total comprehension to be had. So, yeah. So, I mean, Dean claims that this is a joyous work. I mean, okay, I will take him at his word, because yeah, I mean it's kind of joyous. You're reading a book that's 100 years old. I mean, he was still writing it 100 years ago. He was halfway through, but yeah, just the fact that we get to sort of, it's kind of like, why do you climb a mountain? You climb a mountain because it's there.
Yeah. And also, like, at the end of it, I think part of it is the joy of, like, the release. Like, you push, oh, there's the thing.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Which we have done before, because when we read The Three Musketeers, which is also extremely long, we read the unabridged Three Musketeers. I remember we texted each other halfway through, like, what is happening? Why is this happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Dumas wrote that like in sort of sections, and he just, it was like a serial almost, like a Dickensian sort of thing where he's like, I don't know how it's going to end. I'm just going to tell these little adventures. And then now you have to put it all into one cohesive narrative. But I will say, in terms of Finnegans Wake, in case anyone is feeling litigious out there, or anyone from the Joyce estate is listening, Finnegans Wake is in public domain in Canada, and I am recording this from Canada, so we are able to
leave us alone.
Yeah, so we have obviously this is in copyright still in several jurisdictions, but because we're in Canada, we're okay. And I think it's also part of the reason why such a thing doesn't already exist. There's a couple of podcasts that have done these kinds of things in the past, but I'd like to think, again, I don't care if anyone's listening. If you're listening, welcome. I'm glad you're here. But I mean, really, how long are you going to stick with this? Really, I mean, this might be something good to put on as white noise as you go to sleep. If your children are being bad, you put that on there.
You keep playing with you. If you're not quiet in the backseat, I'm going to put on Wake.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be torturing political prisoners. I mean, there's a bunch of different uses for this. But for me, I mean, if you wanted to follow along and listen to this for half an hour a week, and then get to the end and say, I have now read Finnegans Wake. Someone read it to me. And
dope,
and maybe we'll chat about it as we go, then great. I mean, it's fairly unintelligible. However, I think it's important to note that Joyce asserted that every single syllable could be justified. Every syllable.
We'll see.
He has a sentence of 20 words, and he's like, every single syllable needs to be there, and all of it's a pun, and all of it's referencing other languages, and this is a pun on a word in ancient Greek, and this is another one in Hebrew, and this is a really important word in Italian. It's crazy. So I think listening to this and just sort of I mean, we're not going to get any of it because when we don't have that kind of interest. We don't have that interest in pulling it apart. We're just going to see. And I wanted to say that this podcast was inspired by one of my heroes, Michael Ian Black, who is a comedian who you almost certainly know from the world. He's in all the things. He has a podcast called Obscure, which he started. I don't know, it must be close to a decade ago, where he was reading classic literature out loud and commenting on it as he goes. And he's very funny, and it's a very interesting podcast. And I've loved that he read Jude the Obscure, he read Frankenstein, he read Wuthering Heights, and now he's reading An American Tragedy. And he reads it, and he's reading it a cold reading, like just like we're doing, like, so no real prep, and he reads it and then just comments on what he has. I don't have the comedic sensibility of Michael Ian Black in terms of being able to get any kind of humor out of what we're doing, and so I don't know about the commenting, but I do really subscribe to that idea of someone reading you something that you haven't read before, and I've that podcast has led me through 4 books that I never would have read, or had meant to get around to. I mean, I meant to get around to Wuthering Heights one day, and then I read it through that podcast. So what I did was I got a copy of the book, and I would read ahead a chapter, and then he would catch up, and then I would read it. And I'm also in Michael's Patreon, and so I've been able to communicate a lot with him, and I'll let him know about Wake when it's up and running. He'll get in there. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's much commentary to be made because there's so much in here. I mean, it's very clear the connection between Joyce and the Dada movement. And if anyone's not familiar, I mean, the Dada movement was a theatrical movement, a musical movement, artistic movement of the early 20th century, where it was all about sort of certain kinds of chaos. I love the futurists, Marinetti, and just the idea that it's about punishing the audience. It's in different kinds of ways, but it's also about just this experimentation. And Joyce has connections to Tristan Tzara from the Dadaist movement from their time in Zurich in the during the war, as seen in Stoppard. Yeah, there's I don't think there's a lot of commentary to be made. I think we'll have a conversation before or after and figure out what we've heard. But yeah, ultimately it's just going to be the reading. It's been said that Ulysses, because Ulysses is obviously the day book. It's about Bloomsday and Bloom's journey around Dublin. Some people have also called Finnegans Wake the night book because it's about that space between wake and sleep. And so whether or not he's getting to that, it's interesting. I mean, Dean claims that this is one of the most remarkable works of this or any other century, and that's a big claim. I mean, but I don't know. It's
in the same breath of being like, it's unreadable, but it's the most remarkable thing.
Yeah, it's like the 10,000 Monkeys. Wow, look how long it is. No one can read it. It's good. So I don't know. It's there have been other approaches to this. I mean, actually, before we talk about other approaches to this, why don't we take a little break in the middle, because we're half an hour in. So I thought I'll just break this up, take a break, and allow ourselves just to reset a little bit, and then we'll be back with some more talk about Finnegans Wake. There's almost certainly nobody listening, but we are back from the break.
They're here. They're here
in spirit. Everyone's like, yeah, good. I've listened to the first 10 minutes. I got it. Yeah, well done. You keep doing you. Welcome back to Wake. We are talking about the background to this book, this monument, Finnegans Wake, which neither of us have read, and we're going to try to read at some point. Not in this episode. This is the teaser. This will give you a sense of the literary background. This will probably be the entire limit of this kind of research. From here on in, the episodes will feature a little preamble, a bit of a reading, and then a coda to talk about what we've heard, and that's all. And we'll try to do that fairly regularly, a few pages at a time. We're not the first to give a audio go at this. There have been various versions. Waywords and Mean Signs is a group who have put together multiple editions of readings of Finnegans Wake, often set to music, and you can download those at their website. Lots of really interesting things and ways into this text, and really supporting this idea that this is poetry. This is the kind of thing that is elevated by music. I don't know if we're going to be have the production value to actually go and put that music behind it. I know that my favorite podcast, Obscure, as I talked about, does have a lot of that production value behind it. I think we're mostly just going to be reading. Other places, the Agora Foundation get together and they read a few pages at a time weekly as a community building thing, which is great. And then there have been recordings. Patrick Horgan did a recording in 1985. That's a 26-hour recording you can get. You can get versions of it on like CD on tape or CD CD versions, a book on tape kind of thing. So we have a 26-hour version, 1985. In 1995, Patrick Healy, who is a speed reader, did a 19-hour version.
Jeez.
So just think about the 26-hour version. You think, well, that's too long. And so let's take off 7 hours, but it's speed read. Which, I mean, good on you, Patrick Healy. That is a lot. That is, speed reading for that long, because, there's a lot of tripping up, right? When you're going through
He
these.
just kept going. He was like, nope.
I mean, obviously, very famously in Finnegans Wake, there are four. I think there are four. I may be corrected, but again, I'm not here for the facts. 4 different instances where Joyce signals a major rupture that's happening in the world, and he does it with a word with 100 letters in it. The first one happens within the first 2 pages, but there are multiple of these, and a lot of people will interpret those long words as being like a roll of thunder. TJ, do you have your edition there with you?
I do. It's in the other room.
Oh, well, I will. You go get it, because I think it's going to be important that we.
Yeah.
So TJ is running to the next room. This shows you the level of preparation we have in this podcast, and how carefully we guard our quality control. In that we didn't even bring the editions of the book into the podcast studio as we wanted to record it. But I have my edition here, and so I was talking a little bit about the 100-letter word that appears on the first page of Finnegans Wake. For your reference, TJ, this page 3 that comes in after the introduction. And so, just to give you a sense of the kind of nonsense that that Joyce is putting us through, both TJ and I are going to attempt this 100-letter word just here for the podcast without any preparation whatsoever. TJ, take it away.
Baba da gala galata gamira no kono brontonora turna thurna turvara harana sakawa tuhu hudrenta thuranuk.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Felt like I was summoning something.
And there's, of course, an exclamation point at the end of that, because that's important. Let me have a run at it. Ba 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 dalgara gintakiniminar con ron tonneron tuan thun trovar hunarauka skone to hu hornidun thurnuk.
You sound like a dragon, straight up.
Yeah. So I recorded that last month when we did our test recording, and I played that for my kids, and they were delighted. They thought that was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Obviously, there's no meaning. Joyce would suggest, however, 100 letters, which gives us like 40 plus syllables.
Everyone is
meaning in every single syllable. And look, I don't want to annoy the Joyceans out there, because I know that they are a hardcore bunch. If you're interested, go to the Finnegans Wake Reddit subreddit. There are hardcore Finnegans Wake people in there, and if they've got a Google alert going on that when Wake shows up on Apple Music, here come the comments. And I'm
just going to hide our emails.
Hey, look, I'm here to say, if you're here and you're a hardcore Joycean, welcome. I'm not going to fight you all on this. I'm not an expert, but this is being done in good faith, and maybe we're going to learn a thing along the way. And if there are any comments that come in, good, bad, or indifferent, we'll probably read them. We'll incorporate them.
That'll be a fun way to end the episodes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So we have words so we think about Patrick Healy doing a 19-hour long speed reading version, but trying to do that 100-letter word in that time. It's crazy. There have been other ones. Jim Norton and Marcella Reardon did one in 1998, which was 5 hours. Obviously, it's abridged.
Cheating.
I think cheating. Patrick Ball also cheated in 2007 when he did excerpts. And then Barry McGovern teamed up with Marcella Reardon again, but that one took 29 hours in 2021. So there are have been a lot been out there. Others, in addition, Simon Local, Local, Loekle, recorded an incomplete one in 1996, and a company called the Most Ever Company have also put this down. But it's one of those things that, again, there needs to be some kind of demand, right? I mean, if someone's going to invest in the recording of a thing, you're going to want to say, okay, but are we going to be able to sell it? And I don't know if there's a huge captive market for this. So for me, I think it's really important just to sort of think about the cold read. So, I mean, we're both theatre people. We both got a lot of background in theatre. What do you think, like, as a playwright, what do you think the benefit is to cold read?
There's something about that first instinct and that first intention whenever you see things laid out on a page that I think is just really informative, especially um, within scripts, within the world of theater. Oftentimes, the sentence before informs the way that you're going to say the sentence after,
Yes.
right? So keeping just in that raw sort of level of emotion, I think is critical to kind of getting at least to the surface level of a story.
Yeah,
Like,
agreed.
yeah,
I think when actors come in having prepped, I mean, prep is great. You want them to do the preparation. Um, you want them to come to rehearsal ready. But if they come to a first reading already having made decisions,
yeah,
it makes it difficult. If they then come back and say, actually, that speech is cut, and then you get that whole thing of going, but that speech is so important to my character, and you go, well, that's not what this is. Where this is a first read of a draft of a play, and is never going to be staged until draft 7 or something. So just
right.
we're not. So I mean, I've done cold reads in the past where we've cast it in the room and cast always against gender and age and things like that, and said, okay, the old lady character is going to
Just
be
here to
played
hear
by,
the
yeah,
words.
just say it out loud. Yeah. And so, yeah, so I like a cold read. I think a cold read really informs a lot. I mean, it means that there are going to be mistakes, and I'm good with those mistakes. Um, but that's fine. I think that's. I mean, you discover things, and there are certain things they'll stand out. And one of the things that we're hoping to do every now and then is when one of us is reading, the other one is reading along and sort of underlining stuff and going, "Oh, that was cool. I like that phrase," or "That was an interesting thing." Because sometimes you go into these fugue states when you're doing these readings, and then someone will say, "Hey, that couplet in that section," and you go, "What couplet? I didn't hear it because I was
In it.
thinking about my shopping list because I was just saying the words." You go on that automatic pilot, so it's interesting. I mean, another thing that's important to remember is that you may not have picked this up yet, dear listener, but neither TJ or I are Irish.
Nor will we put one on.
We're not going to be putting on Irish accents. As I said, I'm a Malone, so the Malones emigrated from Ireland to Australia in the 1850s. So I've got a long, like a massive, massively distant connection to Ireland. It's so far away that it's essentially nothing now.
And mine is I want to go one day. That's about where I'm at.
Yeah. It's a place you got to go one day. I love this story though. Once my dad was in Ireland in '97 or '98, and he was in a they were driving down this country lane in the middle of the night. I don't know if there was a storm. Maybe that's a little bit on the nose. I don't know. It was something was, it was basically, it was late at night, and my mum and dad were driving in a rental car. They weren't sure where they weren't sure what the, um, where they were going to stay that night, and it was getting late, and they were suddenly getting a bit worried, and they saw this little light on a hill, so they drove up this little drive, and on the fence it said bed and breakfast. So they drove in, and they went up this hill, and they knocked on the door, and no one came, and then they knocked again, and then suddenly a light came on, and then a man shuffled downstairs, and then he opened the door, and they said, "Do you have a bed?" And he said, "Of course, come in." And so he came into my mum and dad came in. And he said, "Well, put your stuff down and then come down and have a cup of tea by the fire." And so they did that, and they came down, and the man looked at him and said, "Where are you from?" And my dad said, "Oh, we're from Australia." He says, "No, you're from Clare." And my dad said, What? And he said, "Your nose, you're from Clare." And he saw from the shape of my dad's face that he was, and we are, and Malones are from County Clare. which
That's
is
crazy.
yeah, and he just could identify where in Ireland my father's ancestors were from by the shape of his nose. Um, and I don't know if that's apocryphal. I mean, that could have just been a story that my dad, but I believe it. You know, it's one of those things like that. Those old connections. I remember the first time I ever went to Ireland. It was like '99, and I remember landing in Dublin and feeling this great sense of peace that I was back in the land of my ancestors. And I hung out in places like Dublin and Wexford for a little bit, but haven't really been back much since. So yeah. So we don't. I mean, so we I do have that connection island, but we won't be putting on accents. We won't be giving you an academic approach. We won't be giving you an informed approach. This won't be mistake free. There's really nothing. But yeah, I just want to get into, for the last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about the themes. The title of the book is a prominent area of debate. Very famously, Finnegans Wake has no apostrophe in the title. It's quite often mistakenly added by well-meaning librarians who think, oh, that's wrong, I should add the apostrophe. But Finnegans Wake, but it is named after a song of the same name, which does have an apostrophe, so you can differentiate between those two. And it's a traditional Irish song that is where the theme of what happens in the book, theme of what happens in the song is replicated in the beginning of the book. It's obviously not quite as clear, but the original song, and I'm not going to play it here, but if you'd like to go to YouTube and look it up, the Clancy brothers do a really interesting version of it. But it's about a man who's a bricklayer who is climbing a ladder, laying bricks on a house, and he falls from his ladder and is killed. Falls and hits his head and dies. So they pick Finnegan up. Finnegan's the man. They pick him up and take him down the road, and they lay him out in the Irish way, where they put a bottle of whiskey at his head and his feet, and they all celebrate his life and stay up all night drinking. And someone spills some whiskey on his head, and he wakes up. And so he both wakes, and it is at his wake. And so Joyce was all about this. The story. He loved this story. They loved the story that was in the song, and so he replicates that. And so they do discuss the death of Finnegan and his revival in the sense of the fall of man. There's a lot of imagery that goes on in there. Anthony Burgess also talks about in his analysis. Anthony Burgess, being the author of Clockwork Orange, is also a great literary man, talked about the meaning of the title being without the apostrophe means that Finnegan can actually be broken down into French fan, Fin, and again, fin again, or end again. And so the idea of he talks about the opposed notions of completion and renewal. It's so begin and so end again. There's also the song about Michael Finnegan begin again. All of these kinds of things sort of factor in terms of the title. I don't know. I mean, do you spend very much time with titles? Is this important to you?
It is. I think that because titles set up expectations, and the fact that it's funny because I'm looking at the book. You sent me the book. I've looked at the title, and it wasn't until you it doesn't have an apostrophe. I was like, oh, it doesn't, because my brain automatically is just like, oh, that's where it is.
Yeah.
So I love that. Titles are important.
So it was originally called Work in Progress. That was Joyce's title for Finnegans Wake. I think Finnegans Wake is maybe a little bit more of a selling point.
I mean, if you say working title, then it's like work in progress or whatever. Then people are like, yeah, no doubt. I read it.
Just letting himself off the hook. And I think it was also because when he wrote it, he was sending sections out to people, and then they would be like, what is this? I don't understand what this is. And so, yeah, it's that made sense when it was in progress. But I think, coming back to the title of Finnegans Wake makes a lot of sense. I mean, it took him 18 years to write it. So, to write this thing, this behemoth.
I'd be so. I'm not gonna lie. It's been close to 2 decades writing something, and people are like, "It's unreadable."
I think it just about killed him. I think it was very close to the reason why he, this is the last thing he wrote.
Mhm.
I mean, it's hard because the book is about dreaming. It's a lot about he says, and very very perceptively, he said in one of his letters, he says, one great part of every human existence is passed in a state which cannot be rendered sensible by the use of wide awake language, cut and dry grammar, and go ahead plot. I mean, considering that one third of every single day we're asleep, right? If you sleep for 8 hours, that's 8 of 24 hours you're asleep. And we just sort of, that's gone. That's gone time. And we wake up the next day and go, oh, I had a dream last night. Or, oh, I slept so well, I don't remember my dreams. Or you may have a nightmare that you'll remember, or a recurring dream that you have when you're a child, or a good dream, you dream about, a fantasy or something good that's happening. But really, and then the other part of it, which I find so fascinating, is to put a word to this concept of hypnagogia, which is the period between sleep and wake, or the period. So when you turn off your light and you lay your head on your pillow, there's that period where you try to go to sleep, and maybe you're litigating the day again, or maybe you're thinking about what you've got to do the next day, or worrying about something or other. But eventually, your brain is going to drift away on a tangent, and then suddenly you're asleep. And that time where your brain takes over and starts illustrating, like going somewhere else, just when it's people talk about drifting away.
Yeah,
um, Joyce is literally trying to recreate the drift.
which is, it's crazy because the only time you actually notice it is when someone tries to wake you up and you're almost there,
Yeah, yeah.
and you're like, I don't know what happened in the past 20 seconds,
Yeah,
but
and you
like,
can't get it back. You can't just be like, I'm going to push a button and go back to that space. You got to then get back there and drift again. And it's a really interesting kind of thing where he's saying this is it's a waking concept. We are awake when this happens, and we're not asleep, because asleep is, there are different phases of sleep. There's light sleep, there's heavy sleep, there's REM sleep, there's different kinds of things, and we dream differently in different ones. And so the dreams that we get are during the REM sleep. But the idea of being awake, but our brain is already taking us to sleep,
mhm.
really helps sort of do that. And one of the things that obviously Joyce is working in a stream of consciousness, but there is a structure. He said it's been said that he took inspiration from the Book of Kells, which is the famous illuminated manuscript that's currently held at Trinity College in Dublin, with this idea of digression and elaboration and that illustration of text. It's interesting. There's lots of useful things in there, but he's not really trying to engage us.
Right.
And I think that's important. Seamus Dean talks about how boredom is most often occasioned by what many readers experience as a loss of narrative impetus in The Wake and also in Ulysses. But the impetus has not been lost. It was never there. It was absent from the beginning.
Yeah, so I can be bored with something that you've never encountered. You're like, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And so the idea of it's kind of like, if I don't know, if I would never accuse you of this as a playwright, but sometimes you get playwrights who kind of lose their way in the third act, or you've written a play and it's pretty good for the first two acts, and then you're like, what is happening now? You've just lost the plot.
yeah,
And that would be a dramaturgy note that I would give you. It'd be like, I don't know what's happening in the third act. Let's think about how to pull this back on. And again, once again, this is not directed at you as a playwright. But yeah, it's but Joyce hasn't done that because he's not trying. He never started that way. He never started on a narrative and then just lost interest or lost touch with it. He's written something that is intentionally out there.
I talking about the fact that this book is stream of consciousness, right? I think that even in a lot of quote unquote stream of consciousness books and literature, there's still a plot. You know what I mean? It's still, they're like, oh yeah, but you can still track what's happening.
Right.
So even going into this with the approach of like, I'm going to read this like I do other stream of consciousness
Yeah.
novels is not going to serve you.
Yeah, like William Faulkner, for example,
Yeah.
who is a tough hang. Like seriously, I'm not a huge fan of Faulkner, um, but you can follow it along. And sometimes there's some of these books will have like a little key that you can
Yeah.
like read the Wikipedia page and say, okay, in this section he travels to pick up his children from the place and he has an encounter with a woman and then he takes them back again, and then you read it and you're like, oh, okay, I kind of sort of see, yeah, okay. And there's some interesting things. Joseph Campbell, who is sort of a famous writer who wrote a lot about mythology, he wrote a book called The Skeleton Key to Finnegans Wake, which is essentially a companion. And there are a lot of these companions that exist. We're going to ignore all of them. I don't care. I mean, to an extent. What I'm going to do is that there is an edition of the book, the Oxford World Classic edition, which has basically broken the book down into subchapters, subsections, and it said, okay, chapter 1, book 1, or chapter 1, section 1 is from this page to this page. So what we're going to try to do is read within the bounds of those subsections. Some of them are very short,
Mhm.
some of them are very long, so some of them need to be broken up. And there is kind of, you can go and generate, like there are other sites that I have where we can where people have written a précis of what happens in that section. So what I'm going to do is we're going to say this section we're going to be reading 1:1, which goes from page 3 to 29 or whatever it is. We're going to read the section, and then we're going to give and the Oxford World Classics edition also gives each section a title. So which another subtitle. Obviously, it's not Joyce's titles; it's written by a scholar, but it means that you can kind of use that to jump off of. We're going to read that, and then we're going to read the précis at the end, say, this is what just happened. And then maybe we'll say, did you
Like,
get any
did
of
you
that?
get that?
Maybe not. I mean, we'll see. I mean, and we'll tinker with it with the structure as we go. But I think, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is one of those things that the language is so in depth. And so there's a lot of, I mean, obviously it's written in English, but he also uses a lot of neologisms, or he coins new words, which is what that means. So he basically invents new words. He uses a lot of portmanteau. So he'll take one word, smash it into another word. Maybe he'll smash it into two or three, and then make these longer words. And he would do that. I mean, that quote I read earlier about his sense of sleep, that was filled with portmanteaus. He
Mhm.
likes to push words together just to play with the language, because English is a spectacularly young language.
Yeah. We're
It's,
borrowing from so many other sources
yeah,
anyway.
stunningly young. And so and we kind of we get really convinced that our generation's speech, I mean, if you go back 50 years, the speech was completely different. I mean, and it's not just new coinage, but it's also just the way that we handle the language. And in another 100 years, we'll sound ridiculous to our
Oh,
ancestors,
100%.
and so just things like, it's been only 400 years since the Elizabethans were speaking in their style. I mean, a lot of the drama and things like that mimicking the sort of the rustic speech, but a lot of it was built up from yeah, I mean, from language comes from isolation, and Joyce is here interested in playing with it. So I mean, Dean talks about how the language of Wake is a composite of words and syllables combined with such a degree of fertile inventiveness that new sounds and new meanings are constantly ingeminated. Which great. I know, it's always nice to get that reassurance for someone who's an expert in it to say, "Oh, by the way, this isn't nonsense."
Yeah. I will say this. I've never in my life felt so inspired by a feeling or emotion or a thought that I was like, I need to make a new word for it. You know?
Yeah,
Which I think is also, it speaks to the desire or just the training of contemporary writers where they're like, you know a depth of words and try to find the best way to twist those words into what you need to feel, what you need to mean,
yeah,
as opposed to the freedom that is. if you can't find a word in the lexicon to fix this, just make one.
Yeah.
Imbue
Yeah. Yeah.
meaning on it yourself.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of people will claim that Shakespeare wrote, invented words, and I think that's probably, I think the reason people say that is because Shakespeare's plays are often the first instance of it in the Oxford English Dictionary, and they'll say, "Oh, no one ever said the word assassination before Shakespeare," and you go, "Well, maybe." Maybe he just said, like, well, what's a cool word that I can come up with when talking about the death of Caesar? I know, assassination. Like that's a big leap. It's almost certainly that
Yeah.
it was a few more steps before that, and he just wrote it down. Um, but yeah, I mean, you see it all the time in youth culture. My kids, I mean, the kinds of things that they come out with, that are being said in the schoolyard is just crazy. But it's all built on something else. There are
100%.
words that come from somewhere else, and so when you have a kid call another kid, say another kid looks, has great stye, and you go, oh, that's a
Style.
yeah, it's a horrible abbreviation, but you understand where it's come from, or
Just like Riz, you're like,
yeah,
yeah.
Riz or Giat or all these horrible things like this.
Ugh.
But then, here in Toronto, there's a very vibrant kind of patois amongst the youth, particularly in Scarborough, which is like 10 minutes that way, with a lot of kids who come from first generation kids, who's a lot of parents immigrated from the Caribbean, and they have adopted words from their parents' culture into Canadian culture, and I'm not going to mimic any of it because it's not my culture, but it's really interesting listening to these kids talking to one another, and using kind of words that have spread. And Drake has a big part to play in that because he uses those words, and so it becomes kind of global now. But it's a really interesting thing of the way that language evolves. But then it doesn't always mean something. There's another quote there. I don't know if you're looking at it. The second
Yeah.
quote there.
It crosses and recrosses the spectrum from sheer noise, the 100-letter word that signifies the annunciatory thunder that presages the fall into language and culture, to polyglottic babbling, to lucid, to lyric sense. It forces the reader to pay attention to the various genealogies of words and their functions, how they are, in their most basic sense, composed of letters and combined into syllables, how I lost my place in the quote. How they are heard and how they are seen, what historic weight and valences they bear, what psychologically, political, and social functions they perform, their proximity to and their distance from grunts and noises, their liberating and their repressive effects, their dependence upon syntax and grammar, and their capacity to generate meaning widely and I can't say that word.
Anarchically.
Thank you. Anarchically, when freed from the systems of governance and communication.
Yeah.
Sometimes the fact that I was raised on hooked on phonics bites me in the ass.
Look, I just love this concept. So that was Seamus Dean again from the introduction. Full credit to him. But I love this quote, that language that we use has this proximity to and distance from grunts and noises, like from words that our far, far ago ancestors were using to communicate. And they're the same kinds of sounds, but we've given meaning to the sounds. And so
Yeah, like ugh, like ugh, like that's
Yeah.
just a noise.
Yeah. And so it's the combination of sounds and noises, and who decided that something meant. I mean, obviously etymology is a big thing, and you look at and go, oh, this is a reason why this is called this, but it's so interesting, their structure. It's yeah, and so he's really sort of pulling it apart and saying this language. I mean, obviously there's a lot of politics in here. Joyce being an Irishman, Irish independence was declared, around, just prior to the time of the writing of this book, but it's also, I mean, the burden that the Irish carry over the oppression of the British. Last when I was in Ireland that time in '99, the people I was drinking with at this pub would still spit on the ground when someone mentioned Oliver Cromwell. Now, so we're talking about 350 years of hatred.
Yeah,
for a man who basically subjugated the entire island. I mean, they were always trying to conquer Ireland, and there was the Ireland put up a pretty good show for a while, but then they had their language taken away, and the language still survives and thrives. I think a lot of people kids still learn to read it in Ireland, and I think there's a lot of reclamation. But it's kind of crazy that so it really defines why Joyce is so interested in language and what was happening here.
Yeah, my favorite part is that their dependence upon syntax and grammar and their capacity to generate meaning. And that kind of goes back to like why the cold read, right? We're
Yeah,
looking at our brains are trained to say, where does this fit in the sentence and how does that affect everything before and after it? And
yeah,
so
yeah,
to interact a book where he's like, I'm constantly playing with that is
absolutely,
can
yeah.
be mind altering. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are 65 different languages used in Finnegans Wake. And Dean talks about how they blend and blur into each other, generating so many possible meanings it is safe to assume that not even Joyce could be aware of all, or even of many, that his readers have found. This seems to indicate that the work is a true Tower of Babel. So it's a really interesting thing that he's trying to do these kinds of things. But I also think it's fascinating to think that there are so many more meanings that readers have pulled out. I mean, do you find that when people are responding to your works, that
All the
people are
time.
finding meaning that you didn't write down?
All the time. People are like, I love the way that you do X, Y, and Z. And sometimes I'm like, sure, absolutely. That's what I meant. Oh, this scene does blah, 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 blah. I was like, I was just trying to get this character out of the room. Sure. Like, and I think
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that is part of it. And I wonder if him sending parts of the book in sections while he was working on it was a detriment, right?
yeah. Oh, yeah,
Because the way that it's structured with the ending being the beginning and vice versa, if you can't see the forest until you see all the trees.
yeah, 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 yeah. And but I mean, jury would be. I mean, maybe I'm sure it affected his writing,
Oh
having
yeah.
that kind of negative perspective. But whether or not there would have been a more cohesive book, it's hard to tell, because I think he wasn't trying to. I think a lot of people look at Finnegan's Wake and criticize it because it's not Ulysses. Um,
He wasn't trying to make
but he
another
wasn't
one
trying to
though.
make another one, I don't think, and so it's interesting. Um, so yeah, but despite all of this stuff about the language, there are characters in this play. It revolves around a family called the Earwicker family, and a family of 5. And so the focus is on the father and mother and their 3 children. The father's name is Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, which is an amazing name. Um, and he's quite
Chimpton. I love
Chimpton. Chimpton, yeah, absolutely. It's really true. And so Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, often abbreviated to HCE, and anytime HCE is referred to, that's who we mean. We may, obviously clarify that as we go, but Joyce uses it, and scholars use it. His wife's name is Anna Livia Pluribel, but that's abbreviated to ALP. So that's the father and mother, HCE and ALP. And then they have 3 children, beautifully named children: Shem the penman, Sean the postman, and Issy.
Issy ain't got no job.
Yes, I love Sean the postman. So we have these characters, and there is a plot. There's Seamus Dean talks about the abiding story is the fall, the repetition of the fall of man. This idea, but he also talks about there's one abiding dispute, which in effect involves 2 questions: what was the fall, and what were or are its consequences? So obviously, the foundational fall is the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, and then what happens after that. And so, in terms of structure, there's very little structure, very little plot. It's broken down into these arbitrary chapters by scholars who have decided that this is where this goes, and this. But Joyce didn't do it. So when we talk about 1-1, 1-2, whatever, those are added later. It's a book that starts with a narrative about an unspecified rumor, some kind of rumor about HCE. Then ALP writes a letter trying to exonerate HCE about this rumor. we also hear about the impact on the sons, and the sons trying to figure out how they're going to replace, obviously, a fall, being generational fall as well, and then the rise of Sean the postman, who ascends to prominence in the end. The book ends with a monologue by ALP, as dawn breaks, so as the night is complete. We won't make sense of any of that as we read through the book, because, as scholars have told us that this is the thing. Both TJ and I are scholars in our own rights, but
cool,
but not in this way. Like, you gain meaning from slave, like laboring over text, but this. I mean, in all, it has been it's one of those things. I think anyone who's actually taken the time to read it, people are I think if you spend months and years reading a 600-page book or analyzing, you're going to end up saying it's good, because
it's cognitive dissonance at some point. You're like, oh, I spent so much time with this, which means
absolutely
it's critical.
Sure. Anthony Burgess calls it a great comic vision, one of the few books of the world that can make us laugh aloud on nearly every page.
I'm gonna be real with you. Listening to the first 20 minutes of it, I was like, nary a chuckle escaped my lips.
Okay, so that was, I think it was like 16 pages, right? So there should have been 16 laughs. So laugh aloud. You should be cackling with the no. It's there's so Harold Bloom tries to break it down, because he's like, look, it's obvious, guys. Look, listen, it's very easy to here's an analysis of a section. I just want to show you this because, just to think, okay, is this what we're supposed to get? He says, only a few pages into the great Anna Livia Pluribel section of the Wake, Joyce Keynes, by earth and the cloudy, but I badly want a brand new bankside, bedampen I do, and a plumper at that. And then Bloom explains that obviously Bankside puns on backside, bedamp on bedamned, and thinks since this is the Liffey River speaking as well as Earwicker's wife, this he's breaking this down. What Joyce is saying is he wishes the Liffey had a south bank where literature was appreciated as it was by Shakespeare's Thames. That's a quote.
How, sir? Yeah. How, and Harold, Mr. Bloom, how?
That's right. I mean, that and that's Bloom quoting James Atherton, with this idea that this single sentence can have so much meaning wrapped up in it, and maybe Joyce spent days, weeks, months laboring over that sentence, and it's easy for our eyes to skip by. And when we hear that sentence, by earth and the cloudy, but I badly want a brand new bankside, bedampen I do, and a plumper at that. You hear that and you go, none of those words go together. Let's move on to the next sentence. So,
right.
And once again, we're not really going to be getting much out of this. I mean, he began this book in late 1922, right after he published Ulysses, and he wrote it. He started the writing in March 1923. He wrote it in fragments and episodes. He wrote it out of order. No kidding. He then published the first section in the literary magazine Transition in 1926, and everyone hated it, just hated it. Because, and so as a result, like we talked about, the subsequent sections took a lot longer. He was dealing with a lot of stuff, his mental health, his poor health, his family tragedies, including the death of his father and his own daughter's mental health issues throughout the 1930s. And so it's no wonder that it took a long time to write. But generally, early publications, including the 11 years of excerpts in Transition, because he kept going back to Transition, were met with outright hostility, including from his friends and his family. So
hostility.
So the people who were close to him, including Stanislaus Joyce, as we mentioned before, he was just like, "What is this? This makes no sense whatsoever." And then Sylvia Beach, who owned Shakespeare and Company at Mile Zero in Paris, who published Ulysses. She published a defense, a book written by a bunch of people who were like, no, guys, it's really good. And this was called Our Examination Round His Factification for Incamination of Work in Progress. Um, and so this was published in 1929. It was a decade after that Finnegans Wake was finally published on the 4th of May, 1939, which is just last week was the 4th of May. So also Star Wars Day, but I'm not sure that factors in.
No. He was like, one day this will be the thing.
Yeah. He was like, hey, so May 4th, you're all still talking about Finnegans Wake, right? And I'm like, no, we're talking about a science fiction movie from the 70s. So 16 years it took him to write this thing. A lot of defenders and detractors, a lot of furious debate.
I will say this, though. Sylvia Beach is a real one for being like, look, we're going to write a book to defend my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot. So, yeah, I mean, so that's Finnegans Wake. I mean, that's kind of it. It's there's a lot to it. That cyclical structure that he has, it's one thing to say, that's a cool trick that he started the thing, and the it's kind of like the last 5 years that goes backwards, or Pinter, or we're doing things that are messing with structure. I mean, but Joyce was basing this on a writing from the 18th century by Giambattista Vico called The New Science, that starts the beginning starts in the end and go. But how are we supposed to know that? Like, how is that clear? Joyce is being like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing that was written in 1725. I'm going to do that,
and they're like, sure,
yeah. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, when we start reading in the next episode, we're going to start in the middle of the first sentence. We're not going to go to the end and pick up the thread, and we'll see how it goes.
I have a confession to make.
Yeah,
I cheated a little bit, and I flipped to the last page.
What?
And I read the last. I don't remember it. Listen, I don't remember it.
No spoilers. Our readers will be listening with bated breath, with that first sentence half sentence in mind. And when we get to the final page, they'll put it all together, and it'll all make sense.
I'll tell you, part of it was me just desperately being like, I gotta try to figure this out.
You were that kid who got under the Christmas tree and looked in the presents.
I never shook the box, but I will say that I was like, there's a couple times when I run into art and I'm all like, have I forgotten how to think? The last time was that movie, I'm Thinking About Ending Things, or whatever that movie's called on Netflix. I watched that and I was all like, did I forget how to movie?
Yeah.
Can I no longer movie?
Well, that's Charlie Kaufman for you. He got me on Synecdoche, New York.
Yeah, and where you're just like, do I think well? Is that a thing I can do? And so I listened to the first part, and I was like, okay. It's like, I'm enjoying this, but I desperately just want, like, there has to be anything you can give me that can,
Yeah,
but and I was like, maybe if I spoil it for myself, I can assure you that it's probably because I didn't do the whole lead up to it, that it didn't work.
So it didn't work. Didn't get that meaning. But meaning is not what we promise here at Wake. And yeah, I mean, that is it for our episode 0. We'll be back next week with episode 1, which will be section 1.1 from the Oxford World's Classic Edition subtitles. And subtitled with the same title as the book itself, Finnegans Wake. And we'll follow that structure as closely as we can as we go. I mean, I like the idea that we have an arbitrary structure in place rather than just sort of putting a bookmark in when we get bored. I think sort of saying this is going to be 16 pages. I think the first passage is, we've used the word punishing a few times today, but it might be a punishing start because it's 26 pages off the bat. But we'll see. We'll see
it's just
how
acclimating you to the water. I just got to dive in.
Look, there are some, and honestly, if we get to a section and it's 78 pages long, I'm not going to say, "All right, guys, buckle in. This is a 3.5 hour episode.
We're gonna figure it out."
Yeah. So we'll take natural breaks and things like that. Sometimes we'll have guests come in. We have lots of people in mind who would like to come in and read sections. People who we admire and people who would be interested in this kind of project. Sometimes it'll just be me because, as I said, TJ's a busy man. But
I will always listen to every
absolutely
recording.
Yeah, we
need
to
will always react.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we've already established this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get that going. And so this is our summer project. As I said, it's May 2024, and we are not promising that we're going to get through this in any kind of specific time. We both are teaching. I have TJ is writing plays. I'm writing a book. So we're busy with other things. So we're not exactly doing this full time, but we're trying to record enough episodes that we can go. I'm going to be in Australia in July visiting family, and my intention is to get my father to record a section. He's not going to want to, but I'm going to make it happen. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be fun. We're going to this has been something that's been on the boil for a while now. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, not to mention, we get to hang out more.
Yeah, any reason for that. So that's great. So this is Wake. I am amazed you're listening. This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegans Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegans Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegans Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.